The more insight we can gain into our athletes using data we already collect, the better. If we can use data that's being collected in situ in the training environment as a means for assessing their fitness fatigue relationship and as a marker of readiness, then that removes the need for additional testing because every time we test, we are adding potentially physical load, maybe more fatigue, but also then the cognitive load and the mental stresses associated with additional testing. So this has been termed invisible monitoring, and we're going to look at all the different ways that you could potentially do this with your athletes. Now, before we discuss all the different potential avenues for invisible monitoring, I want to point out at least my opinion on what this term means, because there is a bit of concern in some circles that invisible monitoring is going against privacy rights and the player engagement needs for our athletes. Some feel it is a method for assessing our athletes without them knowing. For me, however, it's not about testing them so that they don't know. It is more a case of trying to make better use of the information that we're already collecting so that we can reduce the burden of additional needs that we place on our athletes. As always, the purpose with how we're going to use the data, the communication and education styles that we use to have those discussions with our athletes, and then how we are disseminating the findings from our studies are really important. So that's just a quick note I wanted to make. Now, in my last video on combining internal and external training loads, I first mentioned invisible monitoring because tracking the relationship between internal and external load is first and foremost a pretty obvious avenue for invisible monitoring. I'll link to that video, but as a quick reminder or overview of that video. So external load represents the physical work done by the athlete. Most commonly, particularly with team sport athletes, that's seen as distances, sprints, accels, decels, change of directions, for instance. The internal load is the physiological cost to do that work. And therefore, if we're tracking the relationship between these two constructs, we can get some insight into times when, for some reason, which would not necessarily be known off the bat, we'd have to investigate further. But it can help identify times when the cost, so the internal load to that athlete, might be higher than we would expect for that said internal load, so that physical work done. And that might be a case of fatigue. It might be a case of detraining and a loss of fitness. So check out that video in full if you haven't already. We talked about using a simple ratio. We talked about the training efficiency index, which is a ratio that attempts to address scaling issues often seen with using different sized numbers by using different metrics between internal and external load. We also talked about some more advanced techniques for tracking this relationship, including using regression analysis or machine learning techniques to predict the internal load based on an individual athlete's external load. Now, within that, I presented a case study from the applied environment that showed how using that relationship between predicting an internal load measure, in that case, heart rate exertion, and tracking that over time to the actual heart rate exertion worked as a red flag for a particular athlete. So have a look at that for that case study. We're going to look into using a submaximal fitness test for this invisible monitoring. Now, I know what you're thinking. I'm immediately talking about testing. That is not invisible monitoring. That is adding in a test. Well, often these so-called tests are integrated into team training as part of the warm-up. The information is collected without additional kind of testing setup. So technically, it can form a part of invisible monitoring. Now, there have been two fantastic recent papers overviewing submaximal fitness tests. both from Tazil Shushan from Western Sydney University. So in reviewing the literature for all the submaximal fitness tests that had been reported from team sports, they found over 100 different protocols, and they found different approaches to analyzing the outcome measures. So they found a mixture of monitoring locomotive exercise performance. So that's the movement profile. I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a few moments here. Or using RPE, which is rating of perceived exertion, or using cardiovascular, so heart rate indices. And in fact, heart rate measures were the most commonly applied outcome measure for this test. Now, within the heart rate indices, there is heart rate during exercise, which tends to be the last either 30 seconds or 60 seconds of the test, or looking at heart rate recovery, either through heart rate variability or through pure heart rate recovery beats per minute drop off. Now, that can be quite hard to manage in the applied setting, the time immediately post the test, and obviously makes it a little bit more disruptive. And so, unsurprisingly, heart rate during exercise is the most common, but also crucially, the most reliable from the analysis that they were able to do. And again, that is probably the measure that fits into this invisible monitoring approach. Now, this group were also able to put together practical applications and a suggested protocol. And here is that representation of that protocol. So they recommend using a continuous, so rectangular or linear track whereby longer shuttles are used. So there's less of a change of direction demand. You want to aim for a constant intensity, and they recommend one that's between about 75 to 85% of heart rate maximum. The duration should be about 3 to 4 minutes, and they recommend using mean heart rate exercise, so either that 30-second or 60-second period for the last minute of the test. All other usual rules apply in terms of using typical error to establish a meaningful change, but also monitoring any notable changes such as the environment and doing it on a consistent day within the microsite. So remember, the idea around these submaximal fitness tests are that they are simple, they are non-exhaustive, and they are integrated into the training session, often as part of the warm-up. But again, yes, I know you're saying potentially that is a new aspect or a change that you're making. So one study has compared whether tracking the predicted versus actual internal load response to small-sided games in the training session. How does that method compare to the submaximal fitness test heart rate during exercise approach? Now, this paper actually has a particularly special place in my heart because it is dedicated to my former boss and mentor, Nick Broad, who we lost in a car accident in 2013. The paper is published by the group from Paris Saint-Germain at the time. So Ben Simpson, Mathieu Lecomte, Martin Bouchard, and based on the work that first Nick was doing, and then they continued there at PSG. So in this study, they were able to use that method we just described of a standardized submaximal fitness test. In fact, that they used a 12-kilometer an hour straight run over a 50 by 100 meter rectangular course. And on average, the athletes included in this study did that test on 4 occasions, and their heart rate at the end of that exercise, so the end of that fixed, standardized submaximal external load, was assessed. They also then used machine learning to predict heart rate exertion from a number of their small-sided games ranging in size and numbers in situ. So heart rate exertion was predicted based off of the external load parameters from each drill, and then the actual heart rate was compared to what was predicted. And of course, all the usual things were accounted for, particularly the training in the heat and the environmental conditions. So they found a large correlation between within player changes in the heart rate difference between predicted and actual from the in situ small-sided game monitoring with the heart rate changes based on the heart rate from the standardized run. Now, interestingly, they say that yes, it is a large correlation. So perhaps if you are not already doing a submaximal fitness test, then doing this approach on your training drills could be a sufficient way of analyzing fitness fatigue status in situ. But conversely, whilst it's not a perfect correlation, and so perhaps they are looking at slightly different aspects of fitness, which is not surprising if you consider the demands of that very consistent, continuous submaximal run against the chaotic, changeable demands associated with football drills. So, in an ideal world, if you can do both, you may be best arming yourself to monitor changes in fitness fatigue and readiness. And I just want to take a look at their practical applications because I think this summarizes this paper beautifully. First of all, they highlight that mechanical work and force load, which is a measure that is derived from use within the GPS device, looking often at the change of direction work, these kinds of measures are the greatest predictors of internal load responses to small-sided games. This is that importance of not just looking at total distance or not just looking at high speed running, because these lower speed but often higher intensity demands like accelerating, decelerating, and changing direction that are often measured more with the IMUs and the accelerometry are really meaningful to demand on the body. Secondly, this finding that the difference in heart rate between what is predicted for the individual and what their actual heart rate was based on their external load during small-sided games can be used to track players' fitness throughout a season. And interestingly, a moderate, around 4% decrease change in this measure is likely indicative of a meaningful change, in this case of about a 4% increase in maximal aerobic speed. And as they say, this approach can help to eliminate the need for formal fitness testing, i.e. this concept of invisible monitoring that we're talking about, but also if you can use it together to have heart rate from the running, which represents generic fitness, and then the heart rate difference between predicted and actual during small-sided games can be more soccer-specific fitness, and so used together, they can best represent this fitness fatigue tracking. But what about if you're not using heart rate belts? Is there another method that we can use for invisible monitoring in the training environment? Well, one area that's been discussed is looking at the locomotor patterns and the potential changes in how athletes run. Now, one of the first groups to look at this, I believe, was Steve Barrett and his team at Hull, who were investigating the impact through the course of firstly a soccer match simulation protocol and then in professional soccer match play, and comparing what they called locomotor efficiency. They looked into some of the triaxial accelerometer derived measures, so measures such as player load. They use the Catapult Sports system. Also looking at the fusion from the different planes, the 3 planes to player load, and then combining total distance and player load to try and establish this ratio of locomotor efficiency. And they did indeed see changes in this locomotor efficiency across the course of a match and within halves as well. So some potential there that as athletes fatigue, perhaps they change their running style subconsciously due to that fatigue. That might be something we can capture. But of course, we have to be careful because there are massive between athlete differences in accelerometry derived data. Also, the data is being collected on the upper body on these GPS wearable devices between the shoulder blades, and we are trying to infer about lower body fatigue and movement strategy. So we have to be aware of that. And the third thing is also, obviously in match play particular, there can be great variation in the external load demanded. So we have to be aware of the output that we're comparing it against. But can we use this sort of tracking of locomotor efficiency as a kind of measure of neuromuscular fatigue in the training environment? Well, I was part of this study led by Amber Rao, in which we took the data collected in a professional Australian soccer team. External loads were tracked over the course of the season along with internal load. A counter movement jump test was conducted regularly to assess readiness, but also we looked at these accelerometer derived measures, in particular in a standardized small-sided game. This game was 5v5 plus 5 wall players with goalkeepers. It was always the same size, the same time on, time off, same day in the microcycle, same level of coach encouragement, etc. Now, of course, within that, you do see variations in the external load outputs, but the drill itself was a standardized format. So my biased opinion, there's tons of really good information in this study, which is openly available, but I will pop the links below. But I want to draw your attention to two of the findings from the paper. Firstly, that a reduction in flight time, contraction time from the counter movement jump, which is commonly used as a tracking metric for readiness, a reduction in that output resulted in a likely reduction as well in player load per minute and player load slow, so below a certain threshold as well. So firstly, with that finding, we are seeing a correlation then between the intensity measures according to metrics that are calculated by the accelerometer with the jump testing. And so if that is a relationship that is consistent, in theory, that could remove the need for the jump test and allow you to conduct this invisible monitoring through the accelerometry measures from your standardized small-sided game. Secondly, according to both changes in the flight time, contraction time from the counter movement jump, but also changes from the activity profile during the standardized small-sided games, we did observe some changes in the percentage contribution of different planes to player load. But this is quite individualized. And so that makes sense again, because we know movement strategy is very individual, but perhaps there is some potential here. If we can profile how our athletes move in situ and then get an understanding of the natural variation in that and track that over time, perhaps there is something in that percentage contribution across the different 3 planes of movement to your overall movement strategy. So there we focused on some different avenues for invisible monitoring, focusing on the responses within the training environment, whether that's heart rate responses or potentially locomotor movement patterns. Now, we could also look into the strength and conditioning, the weight room, some potential avenues for invisible monitoring as well, in terms of velocity-based training or testing of hamstring or groin strength. Again, we could debate, is that invisible monitoring? But we are using it as training as testing and testing as training. But I will save that discussion for another day. Again, I want to reiterate that for me, invisible monitoring is not about collecting data so the athletes don't know about it. It's more about actually making much more use and gaining more value out of the data that we already collect, so it doesn't require additional burden on them for extra testing. As always with monitoring, this should form part of a multivariate system where we're looking at a number of different measures. And to me, subjective monitoring is really important because that is the athlete's opportunity to share how they are feeling. So even with everything we've talked about today being focused on the objective approach, I still recognize the vital importance of the athlete in this process and the subjective information and even body language and communication that they give us in terms of their own readiness status. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you again soon for another Sports Science Insights video.